The 12 Labours of Heracles. Who was Heracles, and why was he given the 12 Labours? Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, is one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology. Born of the mortal woman Alcmene and the king of the gods, Zeus, Heracles was a demigod, blessed with extraordinary strength and courage. From the moment of his birth, he was hated by Hera, the wife of Zeus, who despised him as proof of her husband's infidelity. She sent snakes to kill him in his cradle, but the infant strangled them with ease. His life was a series of trials and tragedies, but none so defining as the 12 labors he was destined to complete, a path of suffering that would lead him to redemption. The story of the 12 labors begins with madness. In a fit of insanity brought on by Hera's relentless vengeance, Heracles killed his wife Megara and their children. When his senses returned, he was devastated and sought purification. The Oracle of Delphi commanded him to serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 12 years. During this time, Heracles would complete a series of impossible tasks. If he succeeded, he would be absolved of his sins and earn immortality. Reluctantly, Heracles agreed, setting aside his pride and submitting to a king far beneath him in both strength and spirit. The labors were designed to humiliate and destroy him. Yet with each task, Heracles grew not only in power, but in wisdom. He faced beasts that terrorized the land, like the Nemean lion, with its impenetrable hide, and the 9-headed Lernaean Hydra. He was sent to capture wild creatures no man could tame, the Ceryneian Hind, the Erymanthian Boar, the man-eating mares of Diomedes. He cleaned the filthy Augean stables in a single day, defeated the flesh-ripping Stymphalian birds, and subdued the mighty Cretan bull. Each challenge tested not just his might, but his mind, patience, and honor. As his fame grew, so too did the hatred of Eurystheus, and the gods who feared his rising glory. Hera continued to sabotage him, manipulating events to turn peaceful missions into chaos. Despite her efforts, Heracles carried on, but before he could prove himself through impossible feats, he would have to begin at the very beginning, with the first of 12 trials that would define his name for all time. It started not in a distant land or in the halls of the gods, but in the hills of Nemea, where a monstrous lion with an unbreakable hide terrorized the people. This would be his first labor. Labor 1. Slay the Nemean lion. In the land of Argolis, dark tidings spread through the hills and fields. A monstrous lion had descended from the wilds near Nemea, striking terror into the hearts of shepherds and travelers. No weapon could pierce its golden hide, and no wall could keep it at bay. Crops were left unharvested, homes abandoned, and smoke no longer rose from village chimneys. King Eurystheus, hiding behind the throne of Mycenae, sent word to Heracles, who had begun his penance for the madness that had once overtaken him. His first task, to journey to Nemea and rid the land of the lion. With only a bow, sword, and his mighty club, Heracles set forth, unaware that this was just the beginning of a long and grueling redemption. The journey to Nemea was quiet, too quiet. Birds did not sing in the trees, and even the wind seemed hesitant to stir. Heracles walked steadily, following scattered hoofprints and the occasional streak of blood. When he reached the lion's territory, he found no town, no herds, only bones and silence. The lion's roar echoed through the hills like thunder, shaking the leaves on the trees and the courage in lesser men. But Heracles did not flinch. He tightened his grip on his club, scanning the rocky terrain for any sign of movement. He knew that brute strength alone might not be enough. He needed a strategy. This beast was no ordinary lion. It was the child of monstrous gods, born of Echidna and Typhon, feared by man and immortalized in legend. He waited by a narrow ravine, where the lion was rumored to pass each evening. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting gold and crimson over the land, Heracles crouched behind a boulder, his heart steady. Hours passed before he saw it. The lion emerged like a living shadow, enormous and golden, its mane shining as though woven from the sun itself. Its eyes burned with primal hunger, and it sniffed the air, catching Heracles' scent. With a snarl it lunged toward him, swift and silent. Heracles sprang into action, loosing an arrow that glanced off the lion's flank like rain on marble. Another, and another, all useless. The lion roared and charged, and Heracles met it head-on, swinging his club with all his might. The club struck true, a resounding crack echoing across the canyon, but the lion merely staggered, dazed but unharmed. Heracles realized then that this was no battle of weapons. It would be strength against strength, beast against man. As the lion circled, Heracles cast aside his bow and broken sword. He waited until it pounced again, then dodged and seized its hind legs, flipping it onto its back. The two tumbled down the slope, a tangle of limbs and roars. Dust rose around them. Claws raked his arms, teeth snapped inches from his face, but Heracles held fast, locking his arms around the lion's throat. He squeezed with a strength beyond mortal limits, the kind born from gods and grief alike. The struggle lasted long into the night. Stars turned above, unseen as the moon rose over the ravine. Heracles did not let go, even as blood from his wounds slicked his arms. Slowly the lion's thrashing weakened. Its roars became rasping gasps, then silence. At last, the beast lay still. Heracles stood, panting, covered in dirt and sweat. His arms ached, but he had done it. He looked down at the lion, magnificent even in death. He had not just slain a beast, he had conquered a legend. Yet the labor was not finished. He had to return with proof. The lion's hide was impenetrable to blade or fire. How could he take it? He tried to cut the skin with his sword, but the metal bent uselessly against it. He tried fire, but the hide would not burn. Frustration simmered in his chest until an idea came to him. He took the lion's own claw, curved and sharper than any forged blade, and used it to slice into the beast's flesh. To his astonishment, it worked. Carefully, methodically, Heracles skinned the lion, lifting its pelt as one might remove armor from a fallen giant. When he was done, he draped the golden hide over his shoulders and placed the lion's massive head upon his own like a hood. He had no need for trophies. This would be his armor now. When Heracles returned to Mycenae, the people gathered to watch him enter. Covered in the gleaming hide, towering and blood-stained, he seemed more like a god than a man. King Eurystheus took one look at him and shrank behind his golden throne. From that moment, the king refused to see Heracles in person again. He issued future commands through a herald, speaking from the safety of a bronze jar in his storeroom. But Heracles only laughed. The fear of kings meant nothing to him. He had faced the untouchable and emerged victorious. Yet he also knew this was only the beginning. 11 more labors awaited, each one crueler than the last. Still, something had changed within him. As he sat that evening by the palace gate, the lion's hide warm around his shoulders, Heracles allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He thought of his wife and children, lost in a fit of madness, and wondered if they would have recognized him now. Not just for the scars or the burden he carried, but for the way his heart had hardened. He had become something else, half man, half legend. The road ahead was long, but his path was now fixed. Each labor would be a step toward redemption, and perhaps in the end, toward peace. Though the Nemean lion was gone, its memory remained. Shepherds returned to the hills, merchants reopened their routes, and songs were sung of the mighty warrior who had slain the golden beast. Children played games where one was Heracles and the others were lions, falling with dramatic growls in the dust. Even the old men who had once scoffed at tales of demigods now raised cups in his honor. Heracles' name, once whispered with pity, now rang through the valley like a hymn. And yet he did not stay to bask in their praise. The next command would come soon. He knew better than to hope for gratitude from Eurystheus. The king's orders were not tests of service. They were trials born of resentment. Heracles' strength, his divine blood, his favor among the gods, all provoked envy in those weaker than he. These labors were meant to humble him, to break him. But Heracles had faced divine wrath before. What were kings to a man who had faced Hera's hatred since birth? He welcomed the struggle, not because he desired glory, but because it gave him purpose. Where others saw punishment, he saw a path. Heracles carried the lion's hide with him everywhere, not as a trophy, but as armor and reminder. Its weight on his back was like the burden of his sins, yet it also shielded him, both in battle and in spirit. Wrapped in the hide of what once seemed invincible, he walked forward as a symbol of mortal defiance. Gods might toy with fate, kings might issue commands, but Heracles would endure. He had bested the Nemean lion with nothing but his hands. Whatever came next, beast, monster, or impossible feat, he would meet it the same way. As night fell and stars returned to the sky, Heracles left Mycenae. He did not ask what his next labor would be. It would find him soon enough. For now he walked alone under the weight of his first victory. Each step echoed against the road behind him, where the earth itself seemed to remember his footsteps. Far away, wolves howled in the darkness, but none dared draw close. The scent of the lion still clung to him, mingled with his own. He was no longer just a man. He was the one who slew the beast that could not be slain. Though he walked among mortals, tales of Heracles had already begun to pass into myth. In the minds of bards and poets, the lion he killed grew larger with each telling, its eyes more cruel, its hide more golden. Heracles himself became taller, stronger, more divine. But the truth remained, quietly beating in his chest. He had wrestled death in the dust, and it had stared back. The blood on his hands was real. The pain in his shoulders, the silence of a victory bought with violence. These were not tales. They were the cost of redemption. In distant Olympus, the gods watched. Some with pride, others with disdain. Hera scowled, for each success brought Heracles closer to absolution, and that she could not bear. But Zeus, his father, watched with silent approval. He saw in his son not only power, but a resilience that even immortals lacked. The first labor had been conquered, not with magic, but with will. And so it would be again. Heracles' tale was not one of ease, but of endurance. He would fall, he would bleed, but he would rise. Again and again. Thus ends the tale of Heracles and the Nemean lion. It is a story of strength, yes, but more than that. It is a story of facing what cannot be fought with weapons alone, of grappling with what seems undefeatable. It is about the moment when a man becomes something more, by doing what no one else dares. This was only the first of 12 labors, but in many ways, it was the measure of them all. Heracles did not just slay a monster, he reclaimed a piece of himself, and in doing so, set the tone for every battle yet to come. Labor 2. Slay the 9-headed Lernaean Hydra. Far to the south of Argolis, in the dark marshes near the lake of Lerna, a new terror had risen. A monstrous serpent, the Hydra, plagued the land. Born of Typhon and Echidna, like the Nemean lion, the Hydra had 9 serpentine heads, one of which was immortal. Its breath was poison, its blood a deadly venom, and it devoured livestock and people alike. King Eurystheus, still trembling from Heracles' return with the lion's hide, wasted no time assigning this second labor. Heracles was to slay the Hydra and cleanse the land, but this would not be a task of brute strength alone. The beast's regeneration made it nearly invincible, and the swamp it lived in was as dangerous as the creature itself. Heracles prepared for the journey with his usual grim determination. This time he brought with him his young nephew Iolaus, a trusted companion, not to help with the fight, but to manage the chariot and supplies. They traveled through dense forests and boggy paths, their destination reeking of death and decay. As they neared the swamp, a heavy fog rolled in, thick as wool, swallowing sound and light. Birds no longer flew in the air, and the reeds whispered warnings to those who dared step into the Hydra's domain. Heracles dismounted and took his club, bow, and sword. The air stung his nostrils with the acrid bite of poison. The Hydra's lair was hidden within a cave beside the swamp, half submerged, its opening framed by twisted roots and bones. Heracles lit a torch, the flames dancing in the mist. He did not call out. He simply approached, alert and silent. The moment he crossed the threshold, the Hydra stirred. Its 9 heads slithered forward, eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. Each hiss was a chorus of death. Heracles threw his torch ahead, lighting the damp cave in flickering light. The beast's massive body writhed from the shadows, scales like blackened iron, and the stench of death poured from its breath. It lunged. Heracles dodged to the side, swinging his sword at the nearest head. It fell to the floor with a wet thud, but almost instantly, 2 new heads grew in its place, hissing more furiously than before. Again he struck, and again the creature multiplied. The more he fought, the worse it became. Sweat poured down his face as he danced around the snapping jaws, but his efforts seemed in vain. The Hydra was not just surviving. It was thriving. Each strike only made it stronger. Heracles retreated outside the cave for a breath. Frustration etched across his brow. This was a different kind of challenge. Iolaus, watching nearby, had an idea. "Burn the stumps," he called. Heracles nodded grimly, and together they set to work. As Heracles lopped off each head, Iolaus pressed a burning brand to the writhing neck, cauterizing the wound before another could grow. The scent of burning flesh filled the swamp as the Hydra shrieked and thrashed, sending waves through the water and shaking the very earth. One by one, the heads fell, no longer growing back. The coordinated rhythm between uncle and nephew turned the tide. Still, one head remained, the immortal one, glistening with venom and hatred, impossible to destroy with blade or fire. Heracles paused, eyeing the final head. It hissed and snapped, its long neck weaving like a serpent in mid-air. He stepped carefully, avoiding its venomous breath. Then, with a sudden leap, he grabbed it by the neck and wrestled it to the ground. It took all his might to hold it steady as he reached for a golden sword, gifted to him by Athena herself. With a final cry, he brought the blade down, slicing cleanly through the immortal head. Even severed, it writhed and snapped, refusing to die. Heracles dug a deep pit, placed the head within, and covered it with a boulder so vast no man could lift it. Exhausted, bruised but triumphant, Heracles stood over the beast's steaming remains. Black blood soaked the swamp, and the waters hissed where it spilled. He dipped his arrows into the Hydra's venom, knowing their tips would now bring death with a single scratch. It was a dark gift, but one he would use in future battles. Iolaus approached, still clutching a charred torch, and looked at the scene in awe. The land had grown quiet again, the fog beginning to lift. For the first time in years, the villagers of Lerna would sleep without fear. But Heracles knew that Eurystheus would not be satisfied. When Heracles returned to Mycenae, dragging the remains behind him, Eurystheus received the news with an uneasy frown. He had heard that Iolaus helped. With this excuse, the king declared the labor invalid, claiming Heracles had not acted alone. The judgment was unfair, petty, and cruel, but Heracles said nothing. He simply turned away, preparing for whatever came next. He did not fight for the approval of kings. He fought to redeem his soul, and for the people whose lives were spared because he faced what others could not. The Hydra was dead. That was all that mattered. The tale of the Hydra spread like wildfire. Poets marveled at the beast with heads that grew back twofold, and the hero who had the courage and wit to defeat it. Children in Lerna no longer feared the water, and shepherds once again brought their flocks to the lakeside. Temples were built in Heracles' honor, though he never sought them. He traveled always forward, never lingering where praise was sung. Glory, after all, was fleeting. What he sought was forgiveness, something no song could grant. Still, the Hydra's fall marked another turning point in his path toward redemption. The venom from the Hydra would prove both a gift and a curse. In future battles, Heracles' arrows would strike with godlike precision, bringing swift death even to giants. Yet it also tainted his legacy, for some whispered that he wielded poison like a coward, not a warrior. Heracles paid them no mind. He had looked into the eyes of a creature no mortal dared approach, and returned. He had faced a nightmare, and silenced it forever. The arrows were a tool, like his club or his strength. The monsters he would face next would require everything he had, and more. The gods looked on with curiosity. Hera, ever jealous and vengeful, saw Heracles' survival as an insult. She would not allow his success to go unchallenged. Each labor to come would be more dangerous, more twisted, more impossible. But others, like Athena, watched with quiet pride. Heracles had proven not only strength but strategy. Even demigods needed allies, and in Iolaus he had found more than a servant. He had found loyalty. That loyalty would sustain him as the weight of his tasks grew heavier. Though he walked a solitary path, Heracles would never be entirely alone. The Lernaean Hydra had guarded its swamp like a god. Its death brought life back to the land, and Heracles became a legend once more. But deep beneath the earth, where the immortal head was buried, strange things still stirred. Some said that the venom seeped into the roots of the trees, that no flower would grow where its blood had spilled. The land remembered the Hydra, just as Heracles' soul remembered each scream, each strike, and the endless fight in the dark cave. Every labor left a mark, not just on the world, but on the man himself. Heracles bore his wounds like armor. He never complained, never questioned why the gods had chosen this path for him. The madness that once gripped him had faded, but its echoes still haunted him in sleep. In the Hydra, he had seen a reflection of that madness, many-headed, writhing, impossible to control. Slaying it was not just an act of heroism, but of symbolic defiance. He would not be ruled by chaos. He would conquer it, one beast at a time. And though Eurystheus dismissed the labor, the world did not. The people knew. The bards sang. Heracles endured. As he departed the marshlands, the air felt clearer. Birds returned to the trees, and the first signs of spring touched the edges of the lake. Heracles walked on, not looking back. Iolaus followed a few paces behind, guiding the chariot. The road ahead was uncertain, as always. But in his heart, Heracles knew that he had passed another trial. The path to redemption was long, and it wound through darkness and blood, but he would follow it to the end, one labor at a time, one monster at a time, until his soul, like the land of Lerna, was free. Labor 3. Capture the golden hind of Artemis. After facing the fury of the Hydra, Heracles was tasked with a labor unlike the others. There was no monstrous beast to slay, no village to rescue, no venom or fire. Instead, King Eurystheus commanded him to capture the golden hind of Artemis alive. The hind, a deer with antlers of glittering gold and hooves of bronze, was sacred to the virgin goddess of the hunt. It roamed freely through the forests of Cerynea, faster than the swiftest arrow, untouchable even by the gods. Heracles was not to harm it. That was the true challenge. To hunt a divine creature, to outwit it without drawing its blood, would test not only strength, but restraint. Heracles knew this task was a trap. Should he injure the hind, he would draw the wrath of Artemis, whose temper could level mountains and forests. Yet if he failed to bring it to Eurystheus, the labor would go unfulfilled. Still, Heracles accepted the challenge. He set out for Arcadia, where thick woods stretched beyond the eyes of man, hiding all manner of divine and wild things. Days passed as he searched the glades, tracking faint impressions in the earth, slight bends in the underbrush. The hind was elusive, careful, and intelligent. It did not move with fear, but with freedom, as if it danced through the forest just beyond reach. He caught his first glimpse of the creature at dawn. It stood by a stream, bathed in gold light, its coat shimmering like sunlight on water. It turned to him, eyes clear and unafraid, then bounded away so fast that even Heracles could not keep pace. He pursued it tirelessly, through thick woods and steep ravines, across rivers and over mountains, yet the hind always remained just out of reach. It never tired, never stumbled, and seemed almost to play with him. Each day, Heracles grew more determined. He would not harm the sacred beast. He would not fail this test of patience and cunning. For nearly a year, Heracles chased the hind. Through rain and snow, through seasons of bloom and decay, he followed its trail. In that time, he learned the rhythm of the forest, the call of each bird, the whisper of every leaf. He began to understand the world not as a battleground, but as a living, breathing being. The hind was not just an animal. It was part of the forest's soul. And slowly, Heracles adapted. He stopped charging forward with brute strength and started moving with silence, with reverence. His pursuit became a ritual, a kind of worship, as if he too sought the favor of Artemis. One quiet morning, deep in a northern glen, Heracles finally found the hind drinking from a crystal-clear pool. He did not draw his bow. Instead, he crept forward, each step careful, patient. As he neared, the wind shifted in his favor, carrying no sound or scent. In a single swift motion, he threw a net, woven from the reeds of the Lernaean river, enchanted by a local priestess. The net wrapped around the hind's slender form without a wound. It thrashed briefly, then calmed, as if recognizing the care in Heracles' hands. He whispered a prayer to Artemis and gently lifted the creature. The moment Heracles turned toward the road to Mycenae, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The birds ceased singing, the air grew still, and from the trees stepped a figure radiant and terrible, Artemis herself. Her eyes burned with divine light, and her bow was already drawn. "You dare touch what is mine?" she asked, voice like a rushing stream. Heracles knelt, setting the hind gently before him. He did not offer excuses. Instead, he told her of the labor, of Eurystheus, and of his vow to bring no harm to the sacred creature. He asked for her mercy, not for himself, but for the deer. Artemis listened, her gaze hard. Then, with a motion of her hand, the bow vanished. "You have treated it with care," she said, "and your heart was not filled with greed or pride. I will allow this. Once." She ordered him to return the hind unharmed after the king had seen it. Heracles bowed deeply, and with the goddess watching, he continued his journey. He walked slowly, mindful of every step. The hind followed calmly, as if choosing to walk beside him. In that quiet companionship, Heracles felt a strange peace he had never known before. The kind that came not from battle, but from harmony. When Heracles reached Mycenae, Eurystheus rushed from his palace, eager to see the legendary creature. But Heracles did not hand it over. Instead, he told the king that the hind belonged to Artemis, and that he had been given permission to show it only briefly. Eurystheus fumed and demanded that the deer be added to his royal menagerie. Heracles shook his head. "You may look," he said, "but you may not touch." The moment the king turned his back to summon his guards, Heracles released the hind, and it vanished into the forest like a spark into the wind. Eurystheus screamed in fury. Though the king claimed Heracles had cheated, the people saw the truth. Heracles had faced a divine test and passed it without violence. Songs were sung not of conquest but of respect. Children whispered of the golden hind and the hero who chased it across the land without drawing blood. Even the priests of Artemis spoke Heracles' name with reverence. It was said that the goddess herself had watched over his steps. For once, Heracles was not seen as just a slayer of beasts, but as a protector of sacred things. His legend grew deeper, richer, more human. This labor had changed him. In the wild forests of Arcadia, Heracles discovered that not all battles are won with fists. He had come to understand patience, humility, and the value of life untouched. Where before he had charged at monsters, now he moved with thought and purpose. The hind had taught him what no Hydra or lion ever could. It had taught him to listen. As he left Mycenae once more, he did not carry a trophy or wear a symbol of conquest. But he felt stronger for it, in a way that could not be measured in scars or weapons. The gods watched as always. Hera gritted her teeth at another success, but Artemis said nothing. She returned to her woods, her hind once more at her side. Zeus, ever the silent father, allowed himself a smile. Heracles was growing into his strength not just in body, but in spirit. This third labor, though bloodless, had shaped him more than any other. There were still trials to come, darker, deadlier, but Heracles now carried something new within him, the wisdom of restraint. And with that, he stepped into the next chapter of his journey, the forest behind him, and destiny still calling ahead. The forest of Lernaean would remember him, not as a destroyer, but as a guest who walked softly, who gave more than he took. The deer's golden hooves would echo through those trees for centuries, untouched by hunters, guarded by Artemis. And in quiet corners of Greece, old storytellers would lean close to fires and tell of the time a mortal chased divinity, not to trap it, but to understand it. And how, in doing so, he became something more than mortal himself. As Heracles continued his labors, this one stood apart in his memory. He had no wounds to show, no venom-stained arrows, no beast's hide. But he had a memory of golden light, of leaves shifting overhead, of a deer that moved like a dream. And he remembered the moment when the goddess of the hunt looked into his heart and found no fault. That was his true prize. Not glory, not fame, but a moment of grace. It would sustain him through the trials ahead, where blood and death would return. But for now, he carried silence like a shield. In time, people forgot the king's bitterness, but they remembered the hind and Heracles' gentle capture. They spoke of him not just as a warrior, but as a man who grew with each challenge. In this third labor, he had not only proven himself to the gods, but to himself. And though the road ahead would lead him through fire and shadow, the golden glint of that deer in the morning light would always remain, a spark of hope in a world that often asked for blood. With steady steps, Heracles moved on, stronger, wiser, and ready. Labor 4. Capture the Erymanthian Boar. The morning mist still clung to the hills of Mycenae when King Eurystheus summoned Heracles once again. With venom in his voice, he spoke of a monstrous boar that roamed the snows of Mount Erymanthus, terrifying villages and destroying everything in its path. The beast was said to be enormous, with tusks like bronze scythes and a hide so thick no spear could pierce it. This time, Heracles was not to kill but to capture it alive and bring it back. The challenge lay not only in facing the beast, but in subduing it without ending its life. It was another test of strength laced with clever cruelty. Heracles nodded silently and set out for the wild country of Arcadia, where the mountain towered over the surrounding land. The road to Erymanthus passed through thick forests and narrow valleys, where ancient trees whispered tales of heroes and monsters. As he climbed higher, the air grew colder and the snow deeper. Wolves followed from afar, never daring to approach. The boar's trail was easy to find. Whole trees shattered, claw marks along boulders, and massive tracks pressed deep into the frozen earth. The villagers he passed looked at him with both hope and fear, offering food and warnings in equal measure. Before reaching the boar, Heracles stopped at the home of Pholus, a wise centaur and friend to his kind. Pholus welcomed him with warmth and shared his fire and food. They spoke long into the night about the wild beast and the strange lands ahead. Curious, Pholus opened a jar of sacred wine that belonged to all centaurs. The scent wafted into the hills, and soon other centaurs, wilder, less kind, came charging down the slopes, enraged at the theft. Heracles was forced to fight, defending himself and his friend. In the chaos, Pholus was accidentally killed by one of the arrows Heracles had dipped in Hydra's venom. The battle with the centaurs cast a heavy shadow on Heracles' heart. Though the encounter was not his fault, Pholus's death weighed on him. Still, the labor had to be completed. He climbed higher into the mountains, through winds so fierce they seemed to scream. At last, in a snow-covered valley surrounded by sharp cliffs, he saw it. The Erymanthian boar stood as tall as a man, its breath fogging the air, tusks gleaming with frost. Its eyes were red with rage, and it rooted through the snow, tearing up the earth. When it spotted Heracles, it let out a bellowing roar and charged. The ground shook beneath its charge. Heracles braced himself, diving aside just as the tusks slashed through a tree where he had stood. The boar turned and came again, relentless. Heracles dodged each charge, using the snow and terrain to his advantage. He shouted and clapped, driving the beast toward higher ground, where the snow was deepest and the cliffs surrounded them on all sides. The boar fought ferociously, but the deeper it moved into the drifts, the slower it became. Heracles waited until it stumbled in the snow, its massive legs struggling to move, then leapt upon its back with a roar of his own. Wrestling the beast was no easy task. The boar bucked and shrieked, its tusks slashing wildly, nearly goring Heracles several times. But his grip was iron, forged by countless battles. Slowly, using his strength and the terrain, He forced the boar to the ground, wrapping thick rope around its legs and muzzle. The beast thrashed, but it could no longer run. Bound and snorting, it glared at him, furious and humiliated. Heracles patted its side gently. He had won through patience and force, not cruelty. Then he built a sled of pine branches and lashed the boar atop it, beginning the long descent from the mountains. As he returned through the villages, the people gasped in awe. The stories they had heard seemed smaller than the reality of the beast tied behind Heracles. Children pointed and cheered. Elders bowed their heads in respect. Heracles did not linger. He was weary, and the weight of Pholus's death still clung to him like a shadow. The snows melted behind him as he descended into warmer lands. When he reached Mycenae, Eurystheus was so terrified at the sight of the living boar that he leapt into a bronze storage jar and refused to come out until the beast was gone. Heracles laughed, a rare sound, deep and thunderous. He let the boar go then and there, releasing it into the wild, where it would trouble men no more. The creature fled with surprising speed, disappearing into the distant woods. Eurystheus, red-faced and furious, sputtered about future labors. But the people only watched Heracles with growing reverence. Again he had returned, alive and victorious, bearing not destruction but a captured terror. And again he had shown that brute force was not his only weapon. Wit and endurance had been just as vital in this climb through ice and death. The tale of the Erymanthian boar spread quickly. Some told it as a story of wrestling with nature itself, an unrelenting storm of tusks and snow conquered by a man who could bend the world. Others whispered of the death of Pholus, and how even in victory, Heracles could not escape sorrow. Both versions were true. Every labor shaped him, not only in flesh but in spirit. He had come down from the mountains a little older in his soul, aware that power came with a price. Yet he did not stop. There were still more tasks to face, more darkness to meet with light. That night, Heracles rested outside the city, gazing up at the stars. The boar was gone, but its bellow still echoed in his ears. In his dreams, he stood on a snowy cliff again, wind howling around him as the beast charged. But this time he saw Pholus watching, smiling faintly from the tree line. Heracles awoke with a start, heart pounding. He took it as a sign. Loss would follow him just as victory would. All he could do was meet each trial with everything he had. And perhaps, in doing so, he could find something greater than forgiveness, something like peace. As the sun rose over the hills of Arcadia, Heracles packed his few belongings and readied himself for the road. Each labor brought new lessons, and though the king may twist the rules and mock the victories, Heracles knew the truth of what he had accomplished. The wild feared him, but also respected him. He had faced storms and monsters and returned, scarred, but standing. His journey was far from over, but in his heart, the boar was no longer a beast. It was a symbol of the rage within, the strength to master it, and the courage to let it go. The gods above watched in silence. Hera, ever bitter, scowled at his success. Yet others whispered among themselves of Heracles' endurance. His path was no longer just about atonement. With each labor, he grew into the name destiny had given him. Not merely Heracles the Strong, but Heracles the enduring. The world changed around him, reacting to each deed, and while many sought to test him, none could ignore the wake of his journey. The Erymanthian boar was now a part of that legend, a creature too wild for kings, but not for the man who walked among gods and men alike. As he vanished into the horizon, Heracles did not look back. The mountains of Erymanthus faded behind him, their peaks still capped in snow. In their silence, they held the memory of a battle between man and beast, one fought not for blood, but for command of nature's fury. And in that silence, the wind whispered his name, carrying it across valleys, through forests, and into the hearts of those who would one day hear of the man who captured the storm and walked on, always forward, toward his next impossible trial. Labor 5. Clean the Augean stables in a single day. After capturing the Erymanthian boar, Heracles returned to Mycenae, expecting another fierce and bloody challenge. But Eurystheus, ever eager to humiliate rather than honor him, devised a labor not of monsters, but of filth. He ordered Heracles to clean the Augean stables in a single day. At first, it seemed almost laughable. Augeas, king of Elis, owned the largest herds in all of Greece: cattle, goats, sheep, horses, all kept in massive stables that had not been cleaned in over 30 years. The stench could be smelled from miles away. The filth was mountains deep, a festering swamp of waste and rot. It was not a task of strength, but of disgust. Eurystheus had chosen this labor not for danger, but for degradation. To make Heracles grovel in manure would, he hoped, break the hero's pride. Yet Heracles accepted the challenge without a word. He made his way to Elis under a hot, dry sun, the air thick with the promise of dust and dung. Farmers along the way stared in disbelief when he told them of his task. Some laughed, others pitied him. But Heracles knew there was always more to a labor than what appeared on the surface. He would find a way, as he always had, to conquer the impossible. Upon arriving at the stables, Heracles was met by Augeas himself. The old king, proud and dismissive, scoffed at the idea of anyone cleaning his stables in a single day. Heracles proposed a wager. If he succeeded, Augeas would owe him 1/10 of his herds. Amused and certain of Heracles' failure, Augeas agreed, though he did not tell his son, who stood quietly nearby, troubled by the dishonor of his father's bet. Heracles surveyed the stables, walls crusted with filth, fences sinking under years of muck. The rivers Alpheus and Peneus flowed nearby, their waters clear and swift. And that gave him an idea. Rather than remove the filth by hand, Heracles would use nature's force. He tore down sections of the stable walls, breaking through with his bare hands and shoveling the waste aside just enough to clear a path. Then he diverted the course of the two rivers, digging trenches and channels with massive stones in his great strength. Soon, the water surged through the stables, roaring and churning, sweeping decades of filth away in a single afternoon. The stables were not only cleaned, they sparkled with fresh mud and river stones. The animals themselves seemed to lift their heads in surprise at the sudden transformation. Augeas was furious. He had not expected success, and now he was faced with his own broken word. He refused to pay Heracles his promised reward, claiming that Heracles had used trickery, not labor. Heracles stood silent, his jaw tight with anger. Augean not only denied him the reward, but also tried to banish him from Elis. But the king's own son, who had witnessed the agreement, testified in Heracles' favor. Outraged, Augean banished his own son, casting him from the palace. Heracles did not raise his hand against the king this time. He simply left, the rivers flowing behind him, justice washing in his wake. When Heracles returned to Mycenae, Eurystheus laughed. He refused to count the labor as valid, declaring that Heracles had been paid for the task, even though he hadn't been. Heracles clenched his fists but said nothing. He had learned that victory did not always come with recognition. Sometimes, the labor itself was its own reward. He had turned a mountain of filth into a clear path. He had brought cleansing where there had only been rot. Even if kings played their petty games, Heracles knew what he had achieved. The stables were clean, and the land around them reborn. Word of the deed spread far beyond Elis. Farmers spoke in awe of the hero who moved rivers, who bent the will of nature to cleanse what man could not. Children recited tales of the waters surging through the stables like silver snakes. Even in distant cities, Heracles was praised not for his might alone, but for his wit. This was a different kind of triumph, one of cleverness, planning, and the use of force in harmony with the earth. The gods took notice too. Poseidon, god of the rivers, chuckled at the ingenuity. Athena, goddess of wisdom, smiled from afar. Heracles had not just cleaned a stable, he had revealed the decay hidden behind a king's pride. Augean, for all his wealth, had let filth grow unchecked for decades. His stables mirrored his rule. Prosperous on the surface, rotten within. Heracles' rivers washed more than dung away. They washed away illusion. They revealed what true strength could do, not just in battle, but in building, clearing, renewing. It was the labor of a god disguised in human form. And though Eurystheus denied its worth, the people did not. They saw Heracles not just as a slayer of monsters, but a purifier of the land. At night, Heracles rested near a riverbank, listening to the rush of water. He thought of the stables, of Augeas' betrayal, of the boy cast out by his father. He wondered how many more kings hid behind filth and gold, thinking themselves mighty while others suffered. The labors were revealing more than strength. They were showing him the nature of men, how some would challenge you to rise, and others would scheme to bring you low. But no matter what form the labor took, Heracles would meet it. With arms, with mind, or with heart. He was becoming more than a hero. Though some scoffed at the labor's nature, Heracles knew it had required as much from him as any beast he had battled. Filth was not glorious. There were no roaring crowds, no gleaming trophies, only the knowledge that something unclean had been made whole. He had walked into a place others avoided and left it better than he found it. That, to Heracles, meant something. Glory was fleeting, but restoration? That endured. The rivers he redirected would flow for years, feeding the land, remembered by farmers and their children, long after kings forgot who deserved credit. In temples and taverns, the tale took on new life. Some said Heracles had spoken to the rivers, commanding them like old friends. Others said he had used divine water gifted by Zeus himself. The truth was simpler, but no less wondrous. Heracles had seen a way where others only saw filth. He had found power in water and used it not to destroy but to cleanse. That was the mark of something rare. A hero who could heal as well as conquer. A man who could change the shape of the world without lifting a sword. The gods stirred. Hera fumed that another labor had been met, even if not officially accepted. She whispered new schemes into Eurystheus' ear. But other gods began to murmur that Heracles was more than mortal, that he was walking a path few could endure. With each task he grew not only in strength, but in soul. The Augean stables had not brought him glory, but they had taught him something deeper. That sometimes the hardest labors were not those fought with fists, but those faced with determination against what others refused to see. As he moved toward his next labor, Heracles left behind no slain beast, no captured creature. But the rivers still flowed where he had dug them, and the land was cleaner for it. In that, there was something sacred. In every splash of water, in every breeze that now moved freely through the once fouled stables, his labor echoed. He had answered filth with flood. He had not destroyed, but transformed. And transformation, he was learning, was the heart of his journey. Whether through battle, wisdom, or water, he would continue. For there were still labors to come, and his legend was only beginning. Labor 6. Slay the Stymphalian birds. Beyond the mountains of Arcadia, near the dark waters of Lake Stymphalius, a terrible menace plagued the land. Flocks of monstrous birds, born of an ancient curse, had descended upon the region. These were no ordinary creatures. Their feathers were sharp as daggers, their beaks stronger than bronze, and their cries pierced the air like war horns. They devoured crops, tore livestock to shreds, and attacked any who dared approach the lake. Trees were stripped bare, roofs shredded, and the sky darkened beneath their wings. The people of Stymphalius fled their homes in fear. King Eurystheus, always seeking to crush Heracles' spirit, ordered him to rid the land of these cursed birds, an impossible task, or so he thought. Heracles journeyed to the lake, his steps heavy with caution. The sky above was eerily quiet, the silence a warning, more chilling than any scream. The ground near the lake was littered with bones and bloodied feathers. As he approached, the air shifted. A shriek split the sky, followed by the deafening sound of hundreds of wings. The Stymphalian birds rose as one, their bronze feathers catching the light, each one a blade ready to cut. Heracles raised his shield, deflecting a rain of razor feathers. These creatures could not be fought with brute strength alone. If he rushed them, they would overwhelm him. He retreated into the shelter of the trees, thinking fast. He needed a way to draw the birds out, to force them into the open. Deep in the woods, he recalled a gift from Athena, a pair of bronze crotala, noise-making clappers crafted by the god Hephaestus. The goddess had foreseen this labor and given him a tool unlike any weapon. Heracles took the clappers and climbed a rocky outcrop near the lake. As the birds circled overhead, he slammed them together, and a thunderous sound burst across the sky. It echoed off the cliffs, loud as war drums. The birds shrieked in confusion, rising higher, forming a dense cloud above the water. The noise startled them from their nests, driving them into the air in a frenzied swarm. Heracles kept rhythm with the clappers, the sharp clang forcing the birds to abandon their shelter. With his other hand, he drew his bow. Arrow after arrow flew, each one tipped with the Hydra's venom. When a single arrow struck, it pierced multiple birds. Such was their number. The poison did its work quickly. One brush of the arrow was enough to send them falling from the sky, lifeless, into the reeds and waters below. It was not easy. The birds came in waves, shrieking, slashing, raining death. But Heracles held his ground, unwavering. His bow sang, his aim true. For every bird that fell, 2 more came, but he never faltered. The crotala rang out until the air shook with their rhythm. The battle waged for hours, sky and lake painted with feathers and blood. Slowly, the tide turned. The flocks thinned. The shrieks grew fewer. The lake, once a storm of wings, began to clear. The remaining birds, sensing defeat, rose high and fled into the mountains, never to return. Heracles lowered his arms at last, his breath heavy, his body flecked with blood and feather. The people of Stymphalis crept from their hiding places, stunned to see the sky free of shadows. Fields that had lain in ruin were now quiet. Heracles stood alone by the lake, surrounded by the fallen. The water, once dark with dread, shimmered again in the fading sun. He burned the carcasses of the birds, lest their poison infect the land. Then, with no need for words, he turned and walked away. The people watched in silence, unsure whether they had seen a man or a god. The forest echoed with the sound of his footsteps, steady and slow. When Heracles returned to Mycenae, Eurystheus frowned. He had hoped the birds would be too numerous, too fast, too deadly. Yet again, Heracles had turned the impossible into victory. The king muttered something about divine help, about Athena's gift, but it was hollow. Heracles said nothing in return. He had learned that answers mattered less than actions. He had done what no one else could do, not with rage, but with strategy. He had listened, planned, struck, and endured. Another labor complete. Another nightmare banished. Still, he knew the road ahead remained long and perilous. In the cities and fields of Arcadia, Heracles became legend once more. Children played at slaying birds with sticks and stones, and bards sang of the hero who cleared the sky. Yet Heracles himself did not celebrate. The battle had been more than physical. The shrieking chaos of the birds had stirred something deeper, a reminder of the madness that once gripped him, of voices and shadows that overwhelmed the mind. The birds were more than beasts. They were echoes of that past, and slaying them had brought a strange kind of silence to his soul, a heavy, thoughtful silence. He wandered a while before returning to his path. He sat by a quiet stream one evening, polishing the crotala, their surface gleaming in the moonlight. He thought of Athena, of her quiet guidance, and offered a silent prayer of thanks. Not all strength came from the body. Some came from tools, some from allies, some from the ability to adapt when the old ways failed. The birds had taught him that. They had tested not just his endurance but his cleverness, his calm. In that test, he had prevailed. But he also knew that cleverness would not help against every trial. High atop Mount Olympus, the gods took note. Hera sneered at the success, but others, Athena, Hermes, even Apollo, watched with interest. Heracles was growing beyond what they had expected. Not just a brute or a pawn, but something else. A mortal with godlike resolve and a spirit that refused to bow. The Labours were shaping him, sharpening him like a blade against stone. Each one revealed not just his strength, but who he was becoming. The Stymphalian birds had tried to pierce the sky with chaos, and he had brought the sky back to peace. Though he had no trophy to carry from this labor, the absence of terror was his prize. The quiet fields, the restful sleep of children, the safe skies, those were the marks of his work. Heracles needed no golden hide, no boar bound in rope. Sometimes, the greatest triumph was what did not remain. That night, in a village near the lake, a shepherd lit a candle and whispered a prayer to the hero who had driven the dark things away. And far off, Heracles slept beneath the stars, alone, his dreams filled not with monsters, but with silence. The Stymphalian birds would not return. Their nests were gone, their shadows erased from the land. But their memory lingered in the story of the man who had faced them without fear. And in that story, Heracles was no longer just a slayer of beasts. He was a force of order against the chaos of the world. Where others fled, he stood. Where others despaired, he planned. And where others failed, he endured. Each labor was more than a task. It was a transformation. And the man who walked forward now carried more than strength. He carried the will to change the world around him. As Heracles departed Arcadia, the wind carried no more shrieks, only the soft rustle of leaves. The lake shimmered under clear skies, its waters undisturbed. And in the minds of those who remained, a single truth took root. When darkness gathers, when the skies grow heavy with fear, there are some who will stand unshaken until peace is restored. Heracles was such a man. He had faced a storm of wings and walked away calm. And so he traveled on, toward whatever horror came next, bow in hand, and silence in his wake. And in every forest where birds stirred in their trees, there was a moment of stillness. As if even the wild things remembered. The wind would hush, and the world would seem to ask, what monster will he face next? With the defeat of the Stymphalian birds, Heracles had completed 6 labors, only half of the 12 that lay before him. And that brings us to the end of Heracles' first 6 labors, each one a test of strength, courage, and endurance. In the next video, we'll follow him through the final 6, where the challenges grow even more dangerous, and the path to redemption reaches its darkest depths. Labor 7, Capture the Cretan Bull. After silencing the sky at Stymphalian, Heracles was given no rest. Eurystheus, ever jealous and scheming, devised a new challenge for the 7th labor. This time, Heracles was to sail across the Augean Sea to the island of Crete and capture the mighty Cretan bull. This beast was no ordinary animal. It had once been a gift from Poseidon to King Minos, a creature of divine power meant to be sacrificed. But Minos, out of pride, kept the bull alive, and in doing so, offended the god of the sea. As punishment, Poseidon cursed the bull, turning it wild and furious, its eyes filled with flame and its strength matched only by its madness. The bull now roamed the island unchecked, trampling fields, shattering fences, and leaving chaos in its wake. No one dared approach it. Even the bravest warriors of Crete had failed to subdue the beast. Still, Heracles welcomed the labor with grim resolve. He boarded a ship at the coast and crossed the sea, watching the island rise from the horizon like a sleeping beast of its own. The wind carried the scent of olives and fire. As he stepped ashore, the people whispered of his arrival, wondering if this stranger in lion's skin could do what no Cretan had done. Heracles made his way to the palace of Knossos, where King Minos received him with wary hospitality. The aging king eyed the hero with curiosity, unsure whether to hope or fear his success. Heracles asked only for permission to capture the bull. Minos, more than willing to see the creature gone, agreed without hesitation. He even offered men to help, but Heracles refused. This was his labor, and his alone. He asked only for directions to the beast's last known location. Then he set out, following broken trees and crushed stones through the hills of the island. The sun burned overhead as Heracles trekked across the rugged Cretan landscape. He followed signs of destruction, splintered carts, scattered livestock, blackened patches of earth where the bull had pawed the ground in fury. At last, on a wind-swept plain, he saw it. The Cretan bull stood alone, its hide gleaming like silver beneath the sun. Steam rose from its nostrils. Its hooves struck the earth like thunder. When it saw Heracles, it bellowed, a sound that rolled across the hills like an earthquake. The battle between man and beast was about to begin. Heracles advanced slowly, his club ready but his eyes calm. He didn't want to kill the bull. He needed to capture it. The bull lowered its head and charged, horns gleaming, the earth trembling beneath its steps. Heracles leapt aside just in time, rolling across the ground and rising swiftly. Again the bull turned, snorting, and came at him with even greater fury. The two clashed in a storm of muscle and dust. Heracles caught the horns, digging his heels into the earth, arms straining against the creature's raw power. The ground beneath him cracked. The bull roared. The struggle went on, fierce and relentless. Heracles was strong, but the bull was driven by divine madness. It bucked and twisted, trying to throw him off. Heracles held fast, muscles burning, slowly forcing the creature down. Inch by inch, he brought the beast to its knees. With a sudden move, he flipped the bull onto its side and wrestled it into submission. He bound its legs with thick rope, reinforced with bronze. Tying it tight, the bull thrashed but could not escape. Heracles stood over it, panting, sweat streaking his brow. He had won, not with weapons, but with sheer, unshakable will. He led the bull back through the island, the people watching in awe. Farmers wept with relief, children laughed and followed at a distance, and King Minos stood on his palace steps, stunned into silence. Heracles said nothing. He simply guided the beast to the port, where a sturdy ship awaited. The bull groaned and shifted, but Heracles calmed it with firm hands and quiet strength. The ship set sail for Mycenae, cutting across calm waters. Seabirds circled above, and for once, the journey was peaceful. The bull, tired from its battle, lay still beneath the sun. Upon arriving in Mycenae, Heracles marched the bull through the city gates. People scattered, afraid of its size and the fire in its eyes. But Heracles walked calmly, hand on its reins. When he reached the palace, Eurystheus was waiting. He stared at the beast and once again turned pale with fear. He ordered Heracles to take the bull far from the palace and release it. Heracles obeyed, leading it into the hills where it could no longer harm the people. The bull bellowed once before disappearing into the wild, a storm subdued but not destroyed. Eurystheus, frustrated by yet another success, sneered that Heracles had been given help, again, by the gods. But there were no magic tools, no divine gifts in this task. Only the hero's strength, patience, and unyielding resolve. The people, however, knew the truth. They whispered of Heracles with admiration and gratitude. Each Labour added new lines to his legend. The man who conquered beasts, who endured trials no mortal should survive, was becoming something more with each step. Not just a hero, but a symbol of what a man could become when faced with the impossible. The story of the Cretan bull spread across the islands. Sailors spoke of the man who tamed Poseidon's fury. On Crete, songs were sung of the stranger who walked with gods and calmed the storm. Even Minos, though proud, was forced to acknowledge Heracles' greatness. The bull, they said, had been more than an animal. It had been a curse, a divine test, a beast of chaos. Heracles had not destroyed it, but subdued it. He had turned rage into silence, fire into stillness. That was a different kind of strength. As Heracles rested after the labor, he thought not of praise or songs. He remembered the weight of the bull's horns, the strain in his arms, the moment when he nearly lost his footing. Each labor brought him closer to his limits and pushed them further. He knew the path ahead would not grow easier. But he also knew that each beast faced, each challenge met, taught him something vital. The bull had taught him the strength of restraint, the importance of endurance, that there was power not just in force, but in holding firm until chaos passed. The gods watched, as always. Poseidon said nothing, perhaps pleased to see his beast survive. Hera fumed at Heracles' growing fame. Zeus, distant and silent, simply observed. They saw a man whose spirit could not be bent, no matter the shape of the trial. They saw the forging of something rare, a soul shaped by labor, not for glory, but for redemption. And so the labors continued. With each, the world changed a little. And Heracles, battered but unbroken, walked onward, toward the next impossible task, the weight of destiny heavy on his shoulders. In the hills beyond Mycenae, where the bull had been released, shepherds sometimes glimpsed it still. A flash of silver, a trail of scorched earth, but it no longer ravaged the land. It had been touched by a man who was more than a warrior. And though wildness still stirred in its heart, it remembered the hands that had bested it without hatred. That, too, was the mark of Heracles, not just in what he conquered, but in what he left behind. A world a little more peaceful, a beast a little more calm. As Heracles prepared for his next trial, the sea breeze brushed against his face. The smell of salt, of earth, of fire lingered. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and felt the pulse of the world beneath his feet. He had captured a creature born of divine wrath. He had sailed home not with chains, but with presence. And now, another labor waited. He rose, adjusted his lion-skin cloak, and walked forward, knowing the road would never be easy, but it would always be his. Labor 8. Steal the mares of Diomedes. The morning sun had barely risen when Heracles received his next labor. Eurystheus, ever conniving, sent him north to Thrace to steal the mares of Diomedes. These were no ordinary horses. Fed on human flesh, the mares were wild with madness, their eyes red with bloodlust, their mouths foaming with hunger. They belonged to Diomedes, a savage king and son of Ares, god of war. Diomedes ruled with cruelty, delighting in feeding strangers and prisoners to his beasts. His stables were a place of horror, echoing with the screams of the devoured. Eurystheus hoped that this time Heracles would fall, not to a monster, but to a man even more monstrous. Heracles knew this labor would be different. Diomedes was not just a ruler, but a warrior with divine blood. The mares, twisted by years of bloodshed, were faster than wind and stronger than oxen. Still, Heracles accepted the challenge and set off for Thrace, accompanied by a small band of loyal companions. They traveled through forest and field, hearing whispers of the terrible king and his ravenous steeds. Villagers warned them away, describing how even the bravest soldiers had vanished near Diomedes' stronghold. But Heracles pressed on, undeterred, his heart set on ending the reign of terror that poisoned the land. They arrived under cover of night, the moon casting a cold silver light on the dark fortress. The stables were surrounded by high walls, and inside the snarling of the mares echoed like a storm. Heracles crouched low, studying the gate. He would need not just strength, but cunning. Slipping past the guards with quiet steps, he reached the stable doors. The smell of blood hung thick in the air. The horses, upon sensing him, reared and screamed, hooves slamming the floor. Even from a distance, their power was overwhelming. But Heracles moved slowly, whispering to them, hands steady, heart calm. Just as he began to lead the mares away, Diomedes and his men arrived. Torches flared in the darkness and shouts rang out across the courtyard. Heracles turned, facing the king whose eyes burned with cruelty. Diomedes laughed and called upon Ares, drawing his blade. "You think to steal from me, son of Zeus?" he bellowed. Heracles said nothing. Instead, he handed the reins of the mares to his companions and stepped forward. The two warriors clashed in the moonlight, steel against steel, fist against fury. Diomedes was strong, skilled, and filled with rage. But Heracles was something more. He was purpose, forged in pain. Their battle raged across the courtyard. Diomedes struck fast, his blade a blur, but Heracles was faster. He shattered the king's sword with a blow from his club and drove him to the ground. With the strength of 10 men, he overpowered Diomedes and dragged him to the very stables where the mares still raged. In a moment of grim judgment, Heracles threw Diomedes into the stable. The mares, sensing their master, turned on him with unrelenting hunger. The terrible circle closed. The beasts devoured the one who had fed them so many. And with that, their madness began to fade. Heracles watched in silence. It was not vengeance that moved him, but balance. The land had been poisoned by Diomedes' cruelty. Now it was beginning to heal. The mares, no longer tasting flesh, grew calmer. Their wild eyes dimmed. With patience, Heracles harnessed them, soothing them with a steady hand and quiet strength. When his companions returned, they found him leading the mares gently, like a shepherd with his flock. The beasts that once tore men apart now walked at his side, their fire cooled by the presence of one who had faced death without blinking. The journey back to Mycenae was long but peaceful. Wherever they passed, people came out to see the tamed mares. They marveled at Heracles' calm, how he commanded even the wildest creature, not with fear, but with will. Eurystheus, however, was terrified. When Heracles returned, the king refused to see him, sending a messenger instead. He ordered that the mares be released, far from the city. Heracles did as commanded, setting the beasts free into the mountains. Some say they roamed for years, wild but no longer murderous, as if remembering the man who had shown them mercy. The tale of the flesh-eating horses and the warrior who tamed them spread quickly. In taverns and temples, people spoke of the eighth labor with awe. They saw Heracles not just as a slayer of monsters, but as one who could change the very nature of what was broken. The mares had been bred for death, but he had taught them peace. That, many believed, was more powerful than any weapon. Even the gods whispered of this labor. Ares was furious, his son defeated. But others, Demeter, Artemis, even Athena, nodded in silent respect. Heracles had shown not just strength, but transformation. Heracles himself did not celebrate. He remembered the faces of those who had warned him, the haunted eyes of villagers, the twisted laughter of Diomedes. He had won, but the memory of what had been lost remained. Each labor carved something from him, a reminder of the pain the world could hold. But it also left behind something greater, a sense of purpose. He had not been sent to merely suffer or succeed. He had been sent to restore what cruelty had broken. And in doing so, he was beginning to understand the depth of what it meant to be Heracles. That night, he sat beneath the stars, the air cool and still. The mares were gone, but their hoofbeats echoed in his thoughts. He remembered their wild eyes and how they changed. He remembered Diomedes' last look, defiant, then desperate. And he wondered how power could twist men so far from mercy. Heracles did not want thrones or temples. He only wanted to walk the path before him, to meet the labors with all he had. Each task was a step toward something he could not yet name. But he would keep walking, even if the road was soaked in blood. Eurystheus, though shaken by the success, was not done. He had more labors planned, darker and stranger. But in secret, he began to fear that nothing could truly break Heracles. Not distance, nor monsters, nor madness. He was a force of nature now, more than mortal. Yet even as the king plotted, Heracles remained focused. His strength was no longer just in muscle, but in his will to endure, to rise, to change the world one task at a time. The mares were gone, but their story had become part of his legend. In the years to come, poets would recite this tale with reverence. The mares of Diomedes, they would say, were not simply stolen. They were freed. Freed from madness. Freed from blood. Freed by the hands of a man who bore the weight of the world without complaint. Heracles had not slain a beast this time. He had wrestled with something deeper, corruption, cruelty, hunger, and emerged with a victory not just of arms, but of soul. And that, more than any triumph before, set him apart. The people never forgot. In Thrace, they built a shrine where the mares had once roamed, not to honor fear, but to celebrate peace. In Mycenae, the children played with wooden horses, pretending to be Heracles, taming wild things with kindness and courage. And in the mountains where the mares were last seen, some say they still run, free, proud, and forever changed by the man who dared to touch what all others feared. So Heracles continued, his sandals worn by travel, his club scarred by battle, but in his eyes burned the light of one who would not bend. The 8th labor was behind him, the next already on the horizon. He rose with the dawn, ready once again to meet fate on his own terms. Not with cruelty, not with vengeance, but with a heart too strong to be broken. A hero not because he conquered, but because he endured. Labor 9. Obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons. The 9th labor of Heracles was unlike any before it. This time, there was no monster to slay, no wild beast to tame. King Eurystheus demanded something precious, not for himself, but for his daughter, Admete. She wanted the girdle of Hippolyta, the Queen of the Amazons. This was no ordinary belt. Forged by the god Ares, it symbolized the queen's authority, strength, and divine favor. It was said to grant unmatched prowess in battle, worn proudly by the fiercest warrior women the world had ever known. To take it meant entering the heart of the Amazon kingdom, a land where no man ruled, and no intruder was welcomed. Heracles gathered a band of companions and sailed across the Augean to the shores of Themyscira, where the Amazons made their home. The voyage was long, crossing tempestuous waters and passing unfamiliar coasts. On board, Heracles remained silent, his thoughts fixed not on the fight to come, but on the unknown. The Amazons were not monsters. They were people, proud, fierce, and loyal to their queen. Taking the girdle might not require force, but negotiation. For once, this labor may demand words over weapons. Still, Heracles prepared for either path, knowing that peace often hung by a thread. When the ship reached the shores of Amazon land, the warriors emerged swiftly, bows drawn, spears pointed. They wore gleaming armor, their eyes watchful, expressions calm but alert. They had heard of Heracles, some with awe, some with suspicion. Heracles stepped forward, hands raised in peace, requesting an audience with their queen. To his surprise, the Amazons allowed it. Perhaps they were curious, or perhaps they wished to measure the man who had tamed beasts and broken kings. Either way, they led him through a land of fierce beauty, tall grasses, silver rivers, and warriors training under open skies. Hippolyta awaited him on a wide plateau, her presence commanding and serene. She wore her girdle across her waist, a band of bronze and gold that shimmered in the sunlight. She greeted Heracles with grace, her voice strong. "I know why you've come," she said, "and I know who sent you." There was no anger in her words, only a keen understanding. Heracles explained the labor and the wish of Admete. He did not beg nor boast. He simply spoke the truth. Hippolyta listened, her gaze steady. Then, to the surprise of all, she agreed to give him the girdle. "I give it freely," she said, "for a warrior who speaks with honesty and bears the weight of the world deserves no deceit." Heracles bowed in thanks. The warriors around them remained still, uncertain but loyal to their queen's decision. It seemed the labor would end without blood. But far above, on Mount Olympus, Hera watched, furious that Heracles might succeed so easily. Disguised as an Amazon, she descended to Themyscira and spread lies among the ranks that Heracles had come to kidnap the queen and enslave their people. Chaos bloomed like wildfire, confusion turned to fury, and the Amazons prepared for war. Before Heracles could leave, the Amazon camp was in an uproar. Warriors surrounded him and his men, shouting, accusing, raising weapons. Hippolyta tried to speak, but her voice was lost in the rising storm. Heracles saw what was happening. He knew Hera's hand when he felt it. The peace was broken, and there was no time to explain. His men drew their swords. The Amazons charged. The plateau became a battlefield, cries echoing against the cliffs. Heracles fought not out of hatred, but necessity. He did not kill without cause, but he defended himself with the might of 100 men. Hippolyta, seeing her warriors fall and the man she had trusted forced into bloodshed, rushed into the fray. She tried again to halt the battle, but a rogue spear thrown from the crowd struck her in the side. She fell to her knees, clutching her wound, her eyes filled with disbelief and sorrow. Heracles reached her side and caught her before she hit the ground. Around them the fighting slowed. The sight of their queen bleeding stilled the warriors. Heracles held her gently as she pressed the girdle into his hand. "Take it," she whispered. "Let this end." With the girdle secured and Hippolyta in the care of her people, Heracles ordered his men to retreat. They left quickly, the sound of weeping Amazons behind them. The queen would live, but the wound would not soon heal, nor would the wound to trust. On the journey home, Heracles said little. He stared at the girdle, feeling no triumph. This had not been a victory. It had been a tragedy manipulated by divine spite. The labor was fulfilled, but at a cost that lingered heavy in his chest. Sometimes the gods demanded too much, and mortals paid the price. When Heracles returned to Mycenae, Eurystheus took the girdle with glee, presenting it to his daughter as though it had come without cost. Heracles, covered in dust and battle scars, stood quietly, refusing to be drawn into celebration. Admete took the belt, dazzled by its beauty, but never knowing the truth of its price. Heracles left the palace without a word, walking into the silence of the hills. This labor had not tested his strength. It had tested his hope, and it had shown him how quickly trust could be broken by lies. He would carry that lesson with him. In the land of the Amazons, Hippolyta recovered, her strength returning day by day. She bore no hatred for Heracles, only sorrow that peace had been stolen from them. She rebuilt what was lost, restoring trust among her warriors. The girdle was gone, but her power remained. Her rule was not in a band of gold, but in the hearts of her people. And they followed her, not because of a relic, but because of her spirit. Her name became legend, not just for her might, but for her mercy. And in quiet moments, she remembered Heracles, not as a thief, but as a man caught in the games of gods. Heracles' name too grew heavier with time. This labor was spoken of in hushed tones, less for its glory and more for its sadness. Poets sang of the warrior who met a queen and wished only to complete his task without blood, and of the goddess who, fearing his growing light, cast shadows where there could have been peace. It became a tale of misunderstanding, of power, and of the delicate balance between diplomacy and force. Heracles had tried to walk that line, but the gods had not let him. Still, he endured, as he always did. He wandered for a while after that labor, seeking stillness. In a small village by the sea, he helped repair a crumbling dock. The villagers didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. They only knew him as the stranger, with lion's skin over his shoulders and kindness in his hands. He carried logs, mended boats, shared bread. For a few days, there was no labor, no king, no god watching. Just wind, salt, and the creak of old wood. And in that, Heracles found something close to peace. It would not last, but it was enough. The gods watched still. Hera burned with fury that Heracles had survived again. Athena frowned at the injustice, but Zeus, from his high throne, remained silent. He saw the pain his son carried and the strength it forged. Every labor broke something in Heracles, but from those broken pieces, something greater formed. He was not just enduring these trials, he was becoming more than mortal. A man whose name would live beyond temples and scrolls. A man who faced the cruelty of gods and kept walking. Wounded, but not defeated. Changed, but not unmade. The 9th labor was complete. The girdle had been won, but Heracles bore no pride in this task. Only the memory of a queen who gave him trust, and of gods who turned trust into tragedy. He knew now that not every battle came with monsters. Some wore crowns, some whispered lies, and some came from within. But even so, he would face the next task when it came. For each labor was a step toward redemption. And Heracles, son of Zeus, would not stop walking. Not until every burden had been borne, every sin faced, and every shadow passed through. And so he walked, past the city gates, through the trees, and into the gathering dusk. The lion skin shifted on his shoulders. His hands bore new scars. But his eyes were steady. For somewhere out there, another labor waited. And Heracles would meet it, not as a man seeking glory, but as one who had learned the price of peace, and the weight of promises kept in a world ruled by gods. Labor 10. Capture the cattle of Geryon. For his 10th labor, Eurystheus sent Heracles farther than ever before, beyond the known edges of the world, to the far west, where the red island of Erythea lay under the watchful eye of Helios, the sun god. There, in a land kissed by the last light of day, lived the giant Geryon. This monstrous being had 3 bodies joined at the waist, 3 heads, and a temper as fierce as fire. Geryon guarded a herd of magnificent red cattle, known not only for their beauty but for their divine lineage. Eurystheus demanded that Heracles steal these cattle and bring them to Mycenae. It was a journey across sea and desert, a trial of strength, endurance, and unshakable will. Heracles set off, traveling west through burning sands and barren plains. The heat scorched his skin, and the wind blew dust like knives. Days turned to weeks, and still he marched. At the edge of the Libyan desert, the sun's relentless glare finally drove him to rage. He drew his bow and aimed it at the sky, threatening Helios himself. Impressed by Heracles' boldness, the sun god did not strike him down. Instead, he admired the hero's courage and gave him a gift, a great golden cup that sailed across the sea. With it, Heracles could cross the ocean to reach Erythea, the land where Geryon's cattle grazed under the watch of two fierce guardians. The journey by cup was strange and silent. Heracles stood alone in the gleaming vessel, the waves lapping at its sides, stars above him and endless water below. At last he reached the shore of Erythea, where the land blazed with a reddish glow, as if the sun had poured its blood across the hills. There, grazing in the shadow of cliffs, were the cattle of Geryon, sleek, muscular, and red as flame. But Heracles could not take them easily. Guarding the herd was a monstrous two-headed dog named Orthrus, brother to Cerberus, and its master, the herdsman Eurytion. Both were loyal to Geryon and deadly in their own right. Orthrus charged first, snarling and snapping with both heads. Heracles swung his club with deadly precision, felling the beast with a single blow. Eurytion came next, shouting curses and raising his spear. But Heracles struck him down just as swiftly. He moved quickly, binding the cattle and preparing to lead them away, knowing that Geryon would not be far behind. And soon enough, the giant came. The ground trembled beneath Geryon's many feet, and the clash of his weapons rang like thunder. Each of his three heads cried out with fury as he saw the slain guardians and the stolen cattle. Heracles turned to face him, raising his shield. The two warriors clashed on the scorched fields of Erythea. Geryon fought with threefold strength, striking from every angle, relentless and brutal. But Heracles was not only strong, he was precise, patient, and fearless. He waited for the moment when the three bodies lunged together, exposing a shared heart. Then he drew a single arrow, dipped in Hydra's venom, and let it fly. It pierced through the heart of Geryon, and the giant fell with a cry that shook the island. His many limbs thrashed, then lay still, and silence returned to Erythea. With Geryon defeated, Heracles gathered the cattle and prepared for the long return. But the gods were not done testing him. Hera, always seeking to destroy him, sent gadflies to scatter the herd. The cattle stampeded in every direction, and Heracles was forced to chase them across valleys, rivers, and plains. Days passed in a blur of hooves and dust. He tracked each beast down, guiding them back with gentle strength and stubborn will. No beast would escape him. Not now. Not after he had come so far. Eventually, the herd was whole again, and he began the long trek home. The return journey was filled with obstacles. Herding divine cattle across hostile lands invited danger at every step. At the borders of Liguria, Heracles was attacked by giants who sought to steal the cattle for themselves. Heracles fought them off, wielding his club like a god of war. In another land, he built great stone pillars on either side of a narrow strait, what would one day be called the Pillars of Heracles. These marked the edge of the known world, a symbol of how far he had gone, and a monument to human effort against divine challenge. At one point, a rogue river threatened to wash away the herd. Heracles redirected its course by hurling boulders into the flood, building a dam with his bare hands. In another place, a king tried to buy the cattle from him, offering gold and wine, but Heracles refused. These beasts were not his to sell. They were part of his path, his burden, and his promise. He pressed on, step by step, mile by mile, the sun rising and falling across his back, his hands blistered, his feet worn raw, yet he did not falter. He would deliver what was asked of him. Finally, after months of hardship, Heracles reached the gates of Mycenae. The red cattle gleamed in the morning sun as they passed into the city, the people watching in awe. Eurystheus, always shocked by Heracles' survival, received the herd with wide eyes. He ordered them sacrificed to Hera, hoping that perhaps his offering would please the goddess who hated Heracles so deeply. But Hera was not soothed. She burned with rage that even in distant lands her schemes had failed. Heracles had succeeded once more over giants, monsters, and divine resistance. No one else could have done what he had done. Heracles did not stay for praise. He left the cattle behind and returned to the hills outside the city, where he could rest beneath the sky. The wind carried the scent of sea and grass, and the sun was gentler now. He closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. This labor had taken him to the ends of the earth and back. It had tested every part of him, his endurance, his strength, his patience. But he had returned, scarred, weary, but unbroken. And in that quiet moment, he allowed himself the rarest thing: rest. The people of Greece whispered of this labor with reverence. They spoke of the hero who crossed oceans in a golden cup, who built pillars at the world's edge, who faced a three-bodied giant and returned with fire-red cattle. Children played with toy herds, pretending to be Heracles guiding them across mountains. Sailors swore by the pillars of Heracles, believing them to guard the path between worlds. And poets sang not just of the victory, but of the journey, of the man who walked where no man had gone and came back stronger than before. The gods took notice too. Even Poseidon, who rarely showed interest in mortal affairs, watched as Heracles crossed his seas. Athena admired his planning. Helios, who had lent the cup, kept a warm light on Heracles' path. Only Hera turned her face away, her heart burning with resentment. No matter how she tried to break him, he rose. No matter how far he was sent, he returned. Each labor made him more than a man. He was becoming legend, not because he sought it, but because he earned it, step by step, through dust and blood and fire. Still, Heracles felt no triumph. Each labor came with a cost. He remembered Geryon's roar as he fell, the endless days chasing scattered cattle, the river that nearly drowned them all. The labor was done, but his heart was heavy. This was no simple journey. It was a journey through the self, a battle not only of flesh but of spirit. He had walked into the unknown and come back changed, and he knew that the road ahead would demand even more. He had passed through the edge of the world. What could come next? The answer, he suspected, would not be found on maps or coastlines. His labors had begun with beasts and monsters. Now they were pushing deeper into realms beyond life, into the very fabric of existence. But for now, he breathed. He watched the stars wheel above him and listened to the night. The red cattle were far behind. Ahead, only the unknown waited. But Heracles, as always, would meet it with steady hands and a soul shaped by trials no man had ever known. 10 labors complete. 2 remained. But they would not be simple. They would take him to places darker than the earth, deeper than the sea. Still, Heracles walked on as the world watched, silent and waiting for the next story to unfold. Labor 11. Steal the apples of the Hesperides. After the long and grueling journey to fetch Geryon's cattle, Heracles returned only to be sent once again into the unknown. For his 11th labor, King Eurystheus ordered him to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. These divine fruits, glowing with eternal light, were not mere treasures. They were wedding gifts to Hera, placed in a hidden garden at the edge of the world. Guarded by the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening, and a terrible 100-headed dragon named Ladon, the apples were believed to grant immortality. Even the gods seldom dared approach them. This task would take Heracles beyond strength, into a realm of myth and divine deception. The garden's location was unknown, hidden from mortals by both time and the will of the gods. So Heracles began his quest by seeking wisdom. He traveled across the known world, asking seers and sages, wandering through lands where the stars looked unfamiliar. Eventually, he found the old sea god Nereus, known to hold the secrets of the world. But Nereus would not give up his knowledge willingly. He transformed into water, fire, beast, and shadow, but Heracles held tight through each change. At last, the god yielded and told Heracles the way to the garden, far in the west, beyond even the lands of Geryon. On his path, Heracles encountered many perils. In the desert of Libya, he met the giant Antaeus, son of Gaia, who drew strength from the earth. Every time Antaeus was thrown down, he rose stronger. Realizing the trick, Heracles lifted him into the air and crushed him, never letting him touch the ground. In Egypt, the cruel king Busiris tried to sacrifice him to the gods, as he had done with many travelers. Heracles snapped the chains, broke the altar, and struck down the king and his priests. The journey was not just long. It was a test of cunning, patience, and unyielding resolve. At last, Heracles came upon a great mountain where the sky seemed to touch the earth. Here stood the Titan Atlas, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. Nereus had told him that the apples lay within reach of Atlas, for the garden of the Hesperides was not far from where the Titan stood. Heracles called out and explained his task, proposing a deal. If Atlas would fetch the apples, Heracles would bear the heavens for him in the meantime. Atlas, eager for even a moment's freedom from his eternal burden, agreed, and handed the sky to Heracles with a sigh of ancient relief. Atlas walked away, his massive frame stretching after ages of stillness. Heracles stood firm, the weight of the cosmos pressing down upon his shoulders. It was heavier than anything he had borne, not only in body but in soul. Minutes felt like hours, and hours like centuries. At last, Atlas returned, holding 3 glowing apples, radiant as the sun. But the Titan had tasted freedom and decided not to give it up. He offered to deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself, leaving Heracles behind. The deception was clear, and Heracles had to act swiftly and cleverly. Feigning agreement, Heracles nodded and thanked him. But before Atlas could walk away, Heracles asked for a small favor, to hold the sky just for a moment so he could adjust his cloak for the burden. Atlas agreed without thought, stepping back beneath the heavens. The moment the weight returned to the Titan's shoulders, Heracles picked up the apples and departed, leaving Atlas once more trapped in his endless vigil. It was not brute strength that won the day, but wit. Heracles had outsmarted a Titan and held the stars themselves, and now he carried divine fruit in his hands. As Heracles journeyed back, the apples glowed through his pack, illuminating the road ahead. But Hera, ever watchful, was enraged. These were her sacred gifts, and she would not let them go so easily. She sent illusions, shifting the path beneath his feet, creating mountains where there had been rivers, and deserts where there had been forests. But Heracles walked on, unshaken. He had carried the sky. He had seen the face of the Titan. No trick of the gods would deter him now. Each step echoed with the certainty that he was nearing the end of his labors. When he arrived in Mycenae, Eurystheus marveled at the apples. Their golden glow lit the palace halls, and the scent of divine fruit stirred wonder and fear. But Heracles did not linger. The apples were not meant for mortal hands. Following the command of Athena, who appeared in radiant form, he returned them to the garden of the Hesperides. Even Eurystheus could not keep what was sacred to the gods. The apples vanished into myth once more, guarded again by dragon and nymph, untouched by time or theft. Heracles had proven himself not by taking, but by returning what did not belong to men. The people spoke of this labor with hushed voices. They did not sing songs of battle or blood, but of cleverness, endurance, and divine challenge. Heracles had gone beyond the map's edge, spoken with ancient gods, and held the sky itself. He had not slain a beast, but faced the very weight of heaven, and returned with treasures no mortal could ever truly claim. This labor became more than a story. It became a symbol of what it meant to seek the impossible and survive it, to wrestle with the sacred and walk away unchanged, yet transformed. Even the gods, despite their pride, could not help but admire him. Athena, who valued wisdom, favored him more than ever. Hermes, the trickster, smiled at Heracles' clever turn of words. Only Hera remained bitter, furious that yet another plan had failed. Her hatred boiled quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But Zeus, high on Olympus, watched with a father's silent pride. His son had faced titans, dragons, and gods, and still, he endured. Only one labor remained, the final task in a journey that had shaped Heracles into more than just a man. Heracles spent a night under the stars, the same stars he had once held upon his back. The sky seemed different now, not heavier but deeper. He had touched the edge of heaven, spoken to the wind that moved between worlds. The weight of the sky was no longer a mystery to him. It was memory. And in that memory he found peace. For once, there was no rush, no urgency. The apples had been returned. The gods had been faced. And he had walked away with nothing but his name and his strength still intact. The journey had taken him across deserts and seas, through riddles and ruins, past deception and divine fury. But what lingered most was the lesson of Atlas, the truth that even gods can grow weary, that even eternal things can long for rest. Heracles had glimpsed the burden of the sky and understood for a moment what it meant to carry the world. And in that, he saw a reflection of himself. His labors were not just tasks. They were weights upon his back, each one carried not for glory, but to restore balance, to heal a life once torn apart by madness. As he walked back toward civilization, people bowed before him, not just in fear or awe, but in recognition. He was no longer simply a slayer of monsters or a breaker of chains. He was a figure who had touched the divine, wrestled with eternity, and returned. The 11th labor was not marked by blood, but by light. The apples were gone, but their story lived in every whispered prayer, every wondering gaze. And Heracles, though tired, kept walking, for the 12th and final labor awaited him, one that would lead not across the world, but beneath it. Deep in the earth, where no light shines, where souls wander and time stands still, his last task lay hidden. But Heracles no longer feared what came next. He had walked with titans, outwitted gods, and borne the weight of stars. There was nothing left that could break him. Only one labor remained, one last door to open. And though its path would lead him to the realm of the dead, Heracles would go, as he always had, undaunted, determined, and alone if necessary. The 11th labor had shown him his place in the cosmos. Now he would face the final one. And so, as the moon rose and cast its silver glow across the land, Heracles sat in silence, not resting from exhaustion, but preparing for the unknown. For while the golden apples had shimmered with divine beauty, the underworld would hold no such light. It would be a place of shadows and silence, and yet he would enter it willingly, because that was the heart of who he was. Not a hero who fought for trophies, but one who faced what others fled. The apples had tested his patience and wisdom. The next would test his soul. The journey to the garden of the Hesperides would be told for generations. But even more than the tale of the apples, it was the tale of the man who bore the sky, who carried it long enough to learn what burden truly means. Heracles was no longer just completing tasks. He was fulfilling something deeper, a path toward redemption, toward transformation, toward something divine. The apples, golden as the sun, had marked that turning point. And with them behind him, the final chapter of his legend was about to begin. Labor 12. Capture Cerberus. The final labor stood before Heracles like the shadow of death itself. For the 12th and last task, King Eurystheus demanded he descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the monstrous three-headed hound that guarded the gates of Hades. It was not enough to face beasts of earth or gods of sky. Now Heracles would walk into the realm of the dead, a place no living man had entered and returned from. Cerberus, with its snapping jaws, serpent tail, and claws sharp as bronze, was more than a beast. It was the embodiment of death's finality. But Heracles did not flinch. He had faced the impossible before. Now he would face the end. Before setting out, Heracles traveled to Eleusis to be initiated into the sacred mysteries of Demeter. He sought to prepare not only his body, but his soul, for the descent into Hades. The rites gave him protection and guidance, for only the blessed could walk the lands of the dead and hope to return. With torch in hand, he found the entrance to the underworld, deep within a cave at the edge of the world, where the air was cold and silent. He passed through shadows and spirits, guided by nothing but the strength of his heart and the fire in his soul. As he crossed the threshold into the world of the dead, Heracles felt the weight of silence press around him. This was a realm where no bird sang, no wind stirred, and no time moved. Souls drifted like mist, whispering fragments of memories. He saw heroes of old, mournful kings and countless faces lost to history. None spoke to him directly, but they watched, drawn to the rare warmth of life that clung to his body. Step by step, Heracles made his way deeper, never breaking his stride. He was not there to grieve or weep. He had come for Cerberus. At the river Styx, he met Charon, the ancient ferryman. The boatman hissed at him, warning that no living soul could pass. But Heracles stepped onto the boat, his mere presence bending the rules of the underworld. Charon, though reluctant, ferried him across the black waters, the oar creaking with each stroke. Shades watched from the banks, confused and afraid. None dared stop him. Even here, Heracles was a force not easily denied. When the boat touched the opposite shore, he stepped out and walked toward the heart of Hades, toward the palace of the god of the dead himself. Before he could approach the great throne room, he was met by guards of the realm, spirits cloaked in shadow, weapons formed of night itself. But Heracles fought without hesitation, driving them back with the strength of the living. He battled through halls of ash and bone until finally he stood before Hades and Persephone, king and queen of the underworld. They regarded him with ancient eyes. Heracles did not plead. He asked only for the right to take Cerberus, not with trickery or steel, but with his bare hands. Hades, impressed by the hero's boldness, agreed, but only if Heracles could capture the beast without weapons. With a nod, Heracles turned and descended further still, to the dark pit that lay near the gates of Tartarus, where Cerberus prowled. The ground shook with each of the beast's steps. Cerberus emerged from the shadows, its 3 heads snarling, eyes glowing with fury. The dog's breath was poison, and its tail, a snake, hissed with venom. Heracles stood his ground. When the beast lunged, he caught it by the neck, grappling with a strength born from all his labors. The struggle was titanic, a battle of flesh and will, of death versus defiance. The underworld trembled beneath their fight. The serpent tail lashed at his legs, fangs snapping at his heels. One head tried to crush his shoulder, another tore at his side, while the third shrieked in rage. But Heracles did not release his grip. Slowly, inch by inch, he forced the beast to the ground, wrapping his arms tighter until Cerberus could no longer move. He panted, his body bruised and bloodied, but victorious. Cerberus whimpered, beaten but not broken. Heracles did not harm the beast. He merely subdued it, as he had promised. Then, rising to his feet, he began the long ascent back to the world above, dragging the great hound behind him. The path back was even heavier than before. Cerberus growled and resisted with every step, but Heracles did not falter. The dead watched in silence as he passed, the beast trailing behind him. A creature they had never seen turned away. Even Charon, wide-eyed, dared not refuse him a second time. The boat groaned beneath the weight of Cerberus, but the river obeyed. When Heracles stepped back into the world of the living, the sun seemed brighter, the air sharper. Life surged around him, and for the first time, the gates of death had swung open and closed without claiming him. When Heracles returned to Mycenae, leading Cerberus through the streets, the people fled in terror. Eurystheus, upon hearing that the hound of Hades had arrived, screamed and ran to hide in his bronze jar, refusing to come out until the beast was gone. Heracles smiled grimly and waited. Once the labor was declared complete, he led Cerberus back to the mouth of the underworld. There, gently and without cruelty, he released the hound. Cerberus growled once, then turned and vanished into the shadows, returning to his post beneath the earth. The gates closed behind him, and silence reclaimed the cave. The 12th labor was finished. Heracles had journeyed into death and returned, not as a soul, not as a shade, but as a living man who had stared into the dark and refused to bow. No other mortal had done what he had done. No one else had borne such burdens and emerged with both strength and honor. From slaying lions and hydras to taming sacred beasts, to bearing the sky and walking into Hades, Heracles had proven not just his power, but his spirit. He had endured pain, betrayal, sorrow, and trial. And now, at last, the labors were complete. The people of Greece whispered of his deeds with awe. They spoke not only of his might, but of the path he had walked. A path of redemption, of grief turned to strength. They sang of the man who had carried more than any man should, who had faced gods and monsters not for glory, but to reclaim his soul. Heracles had begun these labors to atone for madness, for the pain he had caused. Now he stood reborn, not cleansed, but transformed. The scars remained, but they were no longer marks of shame. They were proof of endurance. Even the gods, eternal and proud, took notice. Zeus watched his son from Olympus, silent with a father's pride. Hera, for all her hatred, had no schemes left. Heracles had faced her every challenge and survived. Hades spoke of him with respect. Persephone whispered his name among the pomegranate trees, and Athena, goddess of wisdom, saw in him the mark of a hero who had earned not just fame but understanding. Heracles had crossed into realms forbidden to mortals, and in doing so had bridged the world of gods and men. But Heracles did not seek temples or thrones. He returned to the quiet hills outside Mycenae, laying down his club beside a fire. The stars shone above, the same stars he once bore upon his shoulders. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, to the wind in the trees, to the breath of the earth. His journey had changed him. Each labor, each monster, each moment of pain had carved something away, revealing not just strength, but wisdom. He was no longer the man who had begun this path. He was something more. Now the labors were behind him. The world was quieter. The weight on his shoulders, though still great, no longer crushed him. He had carried lions, bulls, boars, and the sky. He had fought birds, dogs, dragons, and death. And through it all, he had become a symbol, not just of force, but of hope. That a man can fall, rise, and walk into the darkest place and return. That even the heaviest burdens can be borne. And that even gods take notice when a mortal walks forward, again and again, into the impossible. And so Heracles sat beneath the stars, his heart no longer burdened by guilt, but lifted by purpose. The labors had ended, but his story, his true story, was just beginning. For Heracles was no longer just a hero of strength. He was the hero who had walked through all things and still endured. a reminder to all who came after that the soul, like the sky, can be held if the will is strong enough. And in the quiet of that night, with the fire low and the world still, Heracles smiled. The 12th labor was done. He had returned, and he was ready for whatever came next. Heracles, the redeemed hero. Heracles' labors became more than punishment. They became legend. He was no longer seen merely as a man of brute force. The story showed a figure who learned humility, endured betrayal, and chose mercy when he could have chosen wrath. He outwitted foes, calmed sacred beasts, and honored the gods, even those who despised him. Through each trial, he revealed a deep, unshakable will, a desire not just to be free of guilt, but to become worthy of the divine blood in his veins. These labors forged a hero whose story would echo through time. Though his labors ended, Heracles' journey did not. His life continued to be shaped by fate and divine interference. Eventually, he met his tragic end when his wife Deianira, tricked by a dying centaur, gave him a poisoned garment. It burned his flesh and could not be removed. Knowing death was near, Heracles built his own funeral pyre. As the flames rose, Zeus intervened. Rather than let his son perish, he lifted Heracles into the heavens, granting him immortality. There, among the gods of Olympus, Heracles finally found peace and honor, no longer as a sinner seeking redemption, but as a god. Heracles became a symbol of resilience. For the Greeks, his story taught that strength alone was not enough. It had to be paired with wisdom, endurance, and the willingness to suffer for justice and redemption. His journey was filled with mistakes, but also growth. Though he was born a demigod, it was through his labors, through sweat, blood, and grief, that he earned his place among the immortals. He showed that greatness is not given, but won through trials. And even when the world or the gods seem against you, the only way forward is to keep walking. His 12 labors are now etched into the mythic imagination of the world. Each one reflects a deeper lesson about facing fears, confronting guilt, accepting hardship, and transforming pain into strength. Whether battling monsters or cleaning filth, Heracles treated each task as a step toward redemption. He never quit, no matter how impossible the labor. And in doing so, he became not just a hero of myth, but an enduring human symbol of courage against adversity. His name, passed down through generations, still inspires those who seek to overcome the darkness in themselves and the world. Artists carved him into stone, poets sang of his deeds, and philosophers debated his meaning. Yet beneath all the glory, Heracles remained a figure defined by his humanity. He wept, raged, stumbled, and yet always rose again. His strength was not just in his arms, but in his heart. The gods tested him, and the world doubted him, but he proved that greatness lies not in never falling, but in always rising. That is the truth of Heracles, not just as a slayer of monsters, but as a man who dared to seek forgiveness and found godhood in return. And so the tale of Heracles endures, not just because of the beasts he conquered or the labors he completed, but because he showed that even the strongest must struggle. He walked through death and came back. He bore the weight of the sky. He faced every trial with the hope that he might one day be whole. In doing so, he became a mirror for all who wrestle with guilt, with hardship, with the need to make things right, His labors were not just tasks. They were the journey of a soul, a journey we still recognize today. Thank you for joining us on this legendary journey with Heracles. If you enjoyed this tale, explore our channel Sleep Story for Grown-Ups. We have many more calming retellings from Greek mythology and beyond. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drift off with us again soon. Good night, and sweet dreams.